It's not the Bible study lesson, but I think this is something that you might find useful, you might find interesting. Someone asked me in a Bible study last week it's a good question, if the Palestinians were the descendants of the Philistines, because you see in the Bible there's a lot of fight over living space, fight over land. They're not. I need to tell you who the Philistines were. The Philistines were also a people who arrived in what we call the Holy Land, sometimes we call the Levant or the Near East, arrived after being displaced by war. We think that they were Eastern Mediterranean people. They were called the Sea Peoples. And they arrived about the same time as Joshua, and the Hebrew tribes arrived also in this piece of land. If we had our biblical timeline out, this would be 1500 BC, right around the same time. And so they went to war with each other over living space, basically, just a territorial dispute. The Philistines disappeared in the exile. Remember the story of the exile 600 years before Jesus' birth? The best and brightest of Judah were taken away to Babylon, which is exactly what the Babylonians wanted peoples to do. They wanted to mix them up in kind of a one-world Mesopotamian order. And the Hebrews managed to survive the exile and come home. I mean, that's the story. That's the backstory, is they survived the exile. The Philistines didn't. The Philistines disappeared into the dustbin of history, never to be seen again. So that answers the question, who are the Philistines? But who are the Palestinians? Who are they? So a little bit of history might help us watch the news with more discernment and more clarity. Why is there a war? Who are the Palestinians? And what's the conflict all about? The Palestinians are Arab peoples who are descended from what was known as the Ottoman Empire, which existed from the 16th century into well into the 20th century. It's possible that Palestinian peoples are also descendants from the first jihad, which would be the early 7th century. So they've been there a long, long time. They've been living there a long, long time. But you might remember that in the early part of the 20th century began, the bloodiest century, up till this one, in the human race. And so in World War I, or the aftermath of World War I, the European powers decided to reward Arab nationalists who were revolting against the Ottoman Empire with their own countries, or their own land. And so the French and the British made up countries that had not existed before and might not should exist today. So the French, for instance, drew up Syria and Lebanon. And Lebanon, if I understand it correctly, was a little bit of an afterthought. It was originally just going to be a big Syrian country, but Lebanon was created to protect the Maronite Catholic communities in that part of the world. Jordan, also a made-up country, post-World War I. The British and French simply drew lines and put tribal leaders in charge, like the Hashemites, would be the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And then there's Palestine. And Palestine was a word that wasn't used until after World War I, but they recovered an old Roman word. If you look at a study Bible or a commentary and they refer to Jesus living in Palestine or even sing a hymn, that's an anachronism. Palestine was used by Hadrian in the middle part of the 2nd century forward into the Roman period, and so Palestine was a Roman name used for this country. What the British did is the British had, so let's say the French start Syria, and they found Syria and Lebanon and walk away. The British had a mandate over Palestine, so it was called the British Mandate period of Palestine. Okay, post-World War I, the British also signed something called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which gave Jews the right to return to their ancestral homeland and be safe. It's the only one of these new Arab entities that had Jews in it as a right to return. Now, there are Iraqi Jews and there are Syrian Jews. Most of those Jewish communities eventually would return to Israel because of great persecution. But just in terms of official recognition, the Balfour Declaration said, we will run the British mandate, but we will also allow for Jews to return to their ancestral homeland. The Arabs living there hated it. They hated it. They hated sharing. As I like to say, the secret to peace in the Middle East is Israeli security and Arab honor. They saw no honor in sharing. No one else had to share this way. No other country had to share this way, but the British made them share this way. And then in 1947, the UN proposed a two-state solution that the Israelis, or what would become Israelis, agreed to. They agreed to, but the Palestinians did not agree to it. There was no way they were going to share this land with these foreigners, with these Jews. If you want to, this is an easy thing to search. You can look up Grand Mufti and Hitler. In 1941, the Palestinian religious leader of that time, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, visited Adolf Hitler and wholeheartedly endorsed genocide. I will help you with the final solution if that's what you need. They were happy to do it. And I can show you a place on Highway 6 right now, which is a coastal road running north-south. That's a mountain that Ben Gurion declared Masada to. And that is if Rommel rolled over the British in North Africa, that they were prepared to commit suicide rather than genocide by the Nazis. I mean, this is crazy stuff, right? This has been going on since post-World War I, what we're watching today. This is just the fruit of what's happening. So now you know who they are. Now you know the rancor. Now you know the nexus, if you will, or the answer to peace is Israeli security and Palestinian honor. And if we can somehow root out terrorism and recognize that this is a war against terror, not a war against Palestinians, not a war against people, but rather a war against terror, so that Israelis can be safe to raise their children and to be a sovereign country. If we could recognize that and recognize that this is a war against those who would kill them, I think we can begin to listen and watch the news with a little more discernment and not the easy sound bites, which, quite frankly, it's way too complicated for a news cycle. Our attention spans are about this long, and we just seem to want to find easy fixes, easy answers, and there just aren't any. So please pray for peace. Please pray for safety for non-combatants everywhere in Gaza, of course, but also people who just simply want to live in safety. Part of the Israeli promise, and I want y'all to know, I say this as a Christian friend of Israel, but not an uncritical friend of Israel. I think this government has a lot to do with the problem that we have right now. As I speak to my friend Edon every day, we both agree, fix this first, get rid of the government second. I mean, these things have to be done. There are very few hands that are completely clean in this current situation. But what I ask for us to do is pray for an end to this so that they can have security. When I take groups to Israel, I always say the one thing you can count on is your security. You will be safe on this side of the wire. The tragedy of October 7th is that promise was broken. That promise was broken. They were not safe on our side of the wire. The contract that an Israeli government would have with its people is, I'll take half your salary and taxes, and you're going to give me your children in the army, and you'll never have to worry. You'll always be safe. Okay, well now it's from October the 8th onward, there's sort of a new rethinking, and they'll have to rethink it somehow, and I'm certain that somehow this will be fixed, and we will return, and we will get to go see places where Jesus walked, and we can read the Bible, and we can return in pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But a lot's got to happen before then, and so we'll pray, right? We'll pray for justice and peace. Thank y'all for listening to that. I hope that just gives you a little bit more clarity as you're kind of watching the news. I don't think any news feed is doing a great job with this. I think they fall into either camp too strongly, perhaps, or just into easy answers. So for those of us who are now here for a Bible study, I want us to start by talking about the temple in Jerusalem. You know, this podcast is about Ark and Temple, and what you've got behind you here is a 1/10 scale model at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem of the grandeur of Herod's temple, right? Herod turned what had been a modest affair into the wonder of the ancient world. 46 years to build. I mean, just a crazy, we call it the second temple because it always stayed in use after the return from exile, but this is really Herod's masterpiece, and somebody's got to pay for the thing. You were also blessed to have a model at our back entrance of the temple itself, and I want you to check it out in the glass of the Maloof entrance. It's museum quality, made by Dr. Charles Ellis, and it's one of my favorite toys. A couple years ago, he asked me, he said, I'm a woodworker. I'd like to build you something. What do you want? I said, Herod's temple. And he did it, and it's huge, and it's amazing. And you can actually take the lid off and look at the inside. It's really, really, really cool. But this is also, I can spend a day out there. It's just, I love models of things anyway. And it gives you a sense of the scale of something that had been 17 acres that's now 40 acres, or a tabletop structure that even the Temple Mount itself, the foundation is one of the wonders of the world. But still, you got to pay for something like that. I mean, I've learned that around here. You can build a building, but you still got to maintain it. right? And you start to keep it going. And fortunately, the Hebrews had baked into their religion from Exodus chapter 30, verse 13, if you just want to go there, a way to fund the worship. At the time, it would be funding the tabernacle, but there weren't a lot of them, and so there would be a temple tax or a tabernacle tax that would eventually become the temple tax. The someone who would pay for this thing that you're looking at is every male over the age of 20 until death, and you had to give an annual contribution of a half shekel, okay, a half shekel every year. Now, in the first century, that would be 7 grams of silver or 2 drachmas. Okay, I'm going to bring it home. I know you're thinking, so what, right? Well, I have a friend who's done a wage comparison that can kind of help us out. So his name's Danny Herman, and he's got a website called Danny the Digger. He's an archaeologist. He's a lot of fun. So Danny did a deep dive on 7 grams. What is the value of 7 grams of silver? Well, in one of Jesus' parables, a day's wage by working in the vineyard is a denarius. Okay, it's a denarius, and a denarius is 3.4 grams of silver. So a half a shekel is worth 2 days of labor in the vineyard. Okay, now we're bringing it. Let me bring it home just a little bit more. Okay, a wage comparison of that today would be $50 to $75 U.S. 50. Okay, so now an annual temple tax of $50 to $75 U.S. In the first century A.D., there was a population of 8 to 10 million adult males who would contribute $150 million U.S. to the temple every year. Hello, that's a lot of money running through that thing, okay? And Herod gets a piece of all of it, which makes him the 3rd richest man in the world. Augustus is number 1. His friend Marcus Agrippa is number 2. And then it's Herod. This thing is a cash cow. And remember, Jesus would quote Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11 one day when he stood there in the shadow of the thing. And he said, "You've turned my house into a den of robbers." Yeah, $150 million annually? Goodness gracious alive. And still, there were other ways to give. However, now we can begin to understand this strange little story in Matthew chapter 17 about Jesus and the temple tax. For those of you who have arrived and I'm just yammering on about Israel, you can pick up a red or black Bible, and it's on page 799 if you want to. I'm going to read it to you. When they reached Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" See, now we know what a temple tax is, right? Does your teacher not pay the $50 to $75 a year? He said, "Yes, he does." And when he came home, Jesus spoke of it first, asking, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or from others?" And Peter said, "From others." And Jesus said to him, "Then the children are free. However, so that we do not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook, and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a coin. Take that and give it to them for you and for me." This little miracle is only found in Matthew's gospel, and it seems strange, right? A fish with a coin in its mouth, unless you know about the fish. Oh, now I've taught you about the temple tax. Here's another fun little lesson. We're going to learn all kinds of things today. That's the fish. It's an African tilapia. Yep. It's a little more robust, a little better flavor than the ones you buy at Publix because it doesn't swim around in a pond in Greensboro. Rather, it's a natural fish, and it's got, natural, swims against the current. It's stronger. Locals today will call it St. Peter's fish for the benefit of the tourist, if you will, and to get people to eat that. This is the fish that the fishermen would bring up. Now, the reason why most of the Gospels take place in a 10-mile arc on the northwest shore of the lake is because it's shallow there, and that's where the grass is. And this is a grass-eating fish. So I know part of the miracle is that Peter cast a hook and managed to yank one, but the way that you catch them is with nets. And some of you were with me. I had innumerable trips, but was anybody with me when we actually caught fish on the Sea of Galilee? Okay, so what they have these Jesus boats that are tricked out John boats that just kind of ride around, and they all have to make them the same, so you can't have one more authentic Jesus boat than the other one. The competition, they keep everybody on a level place, and it's a fun little boat ride. And then what they do is these Galilean fishermen make a big show of throwing out a net, and then they pull it up, and everybody goes, "Ah." Well, the reason why nobody catches anything is because Jesus boats are out in the middle. They're away from the fishermen actually doing the work. I mean, there are people out there trying to make a living on the Sea of Galilee, and they don't need us riding around. So we got in the middle reading the Bible and maybe thinking about Jesus still in the storm. And then they throw the net and they pull it up, and it's an empty net. Except one time, a Galilean fisherman threw out a net and he pulled up like 6 fish. Scared him to death because the fish are not in the middle. They eat grass. They eat grass in the shallows, and you catch them with nets. But here's another cool thing about the tilapia that you need to learn, right? So the Gospels kind of make sense. They're mouth brooders, which means that they take their babies in their mouth and they'll put a coin there to stop it up like a stopper, and then they'll let their babies grow. So now when you see the miracle of a coin in a fish's mouth, that's not quite so strange or otherworldly. This fish just had a coin in its mouth as it was a mouth brooder. Isn't that cool? So even now we're learning about the temple tax, we're learning about the fish. Okay, so far so good. Now we've learned about the cash cow, but there were other ways to give when you were in town for the festivals, and these would be your offerings. So I want y'all to turn with me to page 856, which is Luke 21. 856. And this is a story that I bet we all know, but maybe we can see it in a new way. Especially now that we're getting coached up a little bit. Let me tell you, before I read this to you, let me just tell you about it. There were 3 courts in the temple precincts. I'll go back to the court. You had the Temple Mount in the middle, right? I mean, the middle is just sort of the Temple Mount. That's the first court. That's the court of the Gentiles. And then you had the court of the women, which is behind the wall. The temple there's in the middle, and it's got sort of a courtyard around it. So the initial courtyard inside the wall would be the court of the Jewish women, only Jewish women. So if you're a Gentile just visiting this thing, you're just out in the bazaar, the big place, right, spending money and looking at it and that sort of thing. And then Jewish women could go inside, and then you had the court of the Israelite men within that. And within the court of the Jewish women, there were 13 collection boxes that were shaped like trumpets. So these were collection vessels, if you will, and they were labeled. You could make an offering for wood for the sacrifice. You could make an offering for incense, right? Or you could also give alms for the poor. Not unlike buying poinsettias at Christmas time. Okay, you just give a little something, right? Buying a little wood for the service just in honor of Mom. So now that we know that, let's look at this story. It's Luke 21, beginning with the first verse. This is a snapshot of offerings at the temple. Jesus looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all that she had to live on." When some were speaking about, we'll stop right there. We'll talk about the destruction in a minute. So he said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all that she had to live on." Now that we're learning about coinage, the coins that she put in there were the smallest coins in circulation. It was called the mite or the lepton, the bronze mite or the lepton, and it's worth 1/40th of a penny. So her offering is not going to really move the needle, right, when they're bringing in $150 million a year in a temple tax. So what this is this is a gift from the heart. You know, I have my own experience with this. I don't know if they still have Salvation Army kettles or not. I don't know if they have. Do they still have kettles? Do you know? Okay. I mean, they don't. They do have. I'm glad. I mean, I know there's a lot of online giving. I'm an old kettle volunteer. I mean, I'm a kettle guy. And back in the days when there were actually malls, remember we always volunteered to stand out in front of a Macy's somewhere. And I've done it in Decatur, and I've been in Montgomery, and I've been at Birmingham, and just sort of ringing the bell in the cold and watching people sort of avert your gaze. You know, as they walk by, they don't want to look. One of my low points happened in Decatur when a woman literally ran by me wearing a sweatshirt that said, "What would Jesus do?" And, you know, it's just like, really? I mean, it's just a little bit. And I also remember a time when I was in seminary in the Washington area, and they had someone ringing the kettle bell who was obviously doing some sort of community, working off a sentence, you know, or something, some sort of court-ordered community thing. And when people wouldn't give money, he would give such a torrent of profanity that I just emptied my pockets. I mean, I'm just like, you can have it. It was basically robbery. If you've ever done something like that, you know when people give. The people who usually are the most generous are the people who have the least else to give. The people who are the most generous are the people who are living really closer to the bone than you and me. The people I've got data. I've watched people who clearly are making a sacrifice to buy something for their children or their grandchildren, and yet they're fishing around for $1 for that kettle, and it always, those memories make me blush, right, to see people who are heroic in their giving. And in many ways, this is a story about that. I also think it's a story about priorities. So baked into the Hebrew religion are lots of stories about giving. And there's one little scene. As I was preparing for this podcast and learning all about the temple and how it was built and its origins, that sort of thing, in the ark as opposed to the ark, I ran across how Solomon sort of conceived of implementing, if you will, his father's dream by building the temple in 1 Kings chapter 6. You can learn all about it. Someone in a Bible study asked me one time, if half of the book of Exodus is about the creation of a tabernacle in the ark, right? How to make the tent, what colors to make it, how to sew the thing. Where is God's instructions for the temple? And the answer is there are none. There are no instructions. The temple was Solomon's idea or David's idea. Solomon's idea. Solomon just had a good decorator and a lot of money. And so it was a marvel, because we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 6 that he designed it and he built it. And God said right at the end, he said, if you follow my ordinances and my precepts and my laws, I will dwell here. If you do these things. So that's a big if, right? They're going to have to behave for God to bless it. But Solomon does it and he builds it. And we're told in 1 Kings chapter 6 that it took 7 years to build the temple. Wow, Solomon, that's awesome. But guess what? If you keep reading another chapter, 1 Kings chapter 7, we're told that it took 13 years to build Solomon's own house. Got it? 7 years to build God's house, 13 years to build King's house. So I hope God really appreciates what Solomon did for God here. But I've got my own palace to consider here. So we might just consider our own philanthropy, right? We might consider our own priorities. We might consider our own giving. Do we ever give from how would we say it? Give from the front pocket? Do we ever give from the front pocket, or do we just simply give safely? I think that might be a very good lesson for all of us to consider as we think about stewardship for next year. We think about our priorities for the next year. Look at your own pie of philanthropy in light of everything else that you spend your money on, and where do your treasures reveal your priorities? That's a good one, right? God said, I've got a guideline. It's the tithe, but it's not meant to be an end. It's meant to be a launching pad to give as much as you can. Can we be as generous as the widow? Well, okay, all that said, it sounds like God really doesn't like money. And a lot of us will misquote 1 Timothy chapter 6 when we say that money is the root of all evil. Actually, if you really want to look at this lesson closely, I think we're learning that the love of money is the root of all evil, which is what the text actually says. And then there's also a very helpful parable regarding God's priorities and money found in Matthew chapter 20. So I want you to turn to there. It's page 801, Matthew 20, and I'm going to read this familiar story to you and see if you can't hear it in a new way. All right, so Matthew chapter 20. These are the laborers in the vineyard where we got our wage comparison and we learned the value of a denarius. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. And after agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, okay, a denarius, right, he sent them into his vineyard. And when he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, you also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever's right. And so they went. And then he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, and he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, why are you standing here idle all day? They said to him, because no one has hired us. And he said to them, you also go to the vineyard. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first. And when those who were hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, these last only worked 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. But he replied to one of them, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do with what I choose with what belongs to me? So are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. I've always considered this to be a story of the scandal of grace, right? God's amazing grace. Are you envious because I'm generous? You know, some people are just going to be endowed with gifts from God that perhaps we aren't, or somebody's always going to have more. I mean, there are a lot of lessons here. But in light of what we're talking about today, I think this is also a bird's eye view of how God views money. I remembered as I was reading this, I've lived this story actually back when I was discerning a call to the ministry. Actually, I just decided one day I wanted to be a preacher so bad. I bothered everybody in Montgomery for about 4 years until they finally sprung me and let me go and stopped talking about it. But one of the things that I did for my vacation is I took my vacation to Birmingham. It's a church named St. Luke's. This big church in Birmingham was building something that's now at the King's Ranch. And they were building a chapel that for some little girls' home. Do you remember that, Sandy? We had a priest here who started a girls' home. And anyway, we were building a church for it. Well, I immediately volunteered because nothing could be more gratifying than building a church for God and wanting to go to seminary, not considering that I had no building skills. And so none. And so they're standing around. We're trying to find out, okay, what can you do? Well, I'm a roofer. Okay, great. You do that. Okay, what can you do? I'm a framer. Okay, you do that. What can you do? I'm a general handyman. Rich, what can you do? Cue the crickets. Okay, I'm like the guy at the vineyard who's just the last guy in the line. I'm the loser on the team. And they said, okay, Rich, if you ever go out to King's Home, you'll see this. Rich, this is a post hole digger, right? And I got to dig post holes in August for a fence that goes around the chapel, and that is the Rich Webster Memorial Fence. And what's really cool about it is that they took our picture. We were all the builders of the chapel. I'm not the builder of the chapel. Okay? I'm the post hole guy, which is the lowest form of labor. I've never been that sore in my life. Can you imagine how the skilled workers would feel if post hole guy got paid the same thing as the building manager? I mean, there you go. That brings the story home. When it comes to money, in God's own generosity with us, I want us to consider this. Maybe this parable in this way. We are a prosperous community. Duh. We are by demographically, all of us considered first world wealth, first world people, first world problems. I would like us to consider, or to remind all of us successful people, that money is a tool, and it can be used for good, and it can be used for bad. Okay, but it's simply a tool. It's like tofu. We put the flavor into it. The love of money is the root of all evil. Here's another thing I'm going to ask us to consider. The creation of wealth is a talent. For those of us who know how to make money, that's a talent. It's like art or singing. It's like having a skill that God has given us. It's a talent. But it doesn't make us any smarter than anybody else, and it doesn't make us any more special than anybody else. It's just something that some of us happen to be really good at doing. So the question is how can we honor God who's given us this talent for wealth creation, legacy creation? How can we use that talent to build the kingdom? There are two Roman people that Paul met when he arrived in Corinth. They were actually business associates, but they had been displaced from Rome. And we're told in Acts chapter 18 that he meets Priscilla and Aquila. And Priscilla and Aquila are people of great means, and they use their means to start churches. I mean, churches have got to meet somewhere, so they met in their homes, and then they started churches in other places, which is to say that for those of us who've been given much, then we're also expected to do much, right? We do with what we've been given. So please, let's consider that our own ability to create wealth or to generate security for our families is also an opportunity for us to create a better Birmingham, right? And a better St. Luke's was not put on this earth to be the best run nonprofit Birmingham. It was not put on this earth to be the temple, but rather a conduit so that our generativity, our brains, our connections, our connectivity can all come together and be a launching pad to change the world. Now that's a vision, that's a God's eye vision of money. Okay, so we'll keep going because there's another story. So I've been reading you gospel stories, and we've been talking about Hebrew scripture stories, but this is a story about us, and it's found on page. Let's see here. Let me find it. Oh, here it is. Acts chapter 3, page 886. Acts chapter 3, 886. This is another cool money story. So the church is like really, really young in Acts chapter 3. As a matter of fact, my friend Edon calls the early church a kibbutz. Edon's from a kibbutz in Israel, which is a planned, transactional, even a socialist utopia, if you will, where everyone shares and everyone has a share in things, that everyone has a job and everyone shares in common so that everyone is safe. Edon says that sounds a lot like the early Christian movement, that it also was a kibbutz. And that's just something to consider when we think about, again, the role of money and faith and what we can do with it. Well, one day we got Peter and John, and they're going into the temple at the hour of prayer. This is Acts chapter 3. They're still doing Jewish things. They're still Jewish people. They just believe that now that they've met the risen Christ, who is the Messiah. And so we'll pick it up right there. One day, Peter and John were going up to the temple at the hour of prayer at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And a man from birth was being carried in. And the people would lay him daily at the gate of the temple called the Beautiful Gate, so that he could ask for alms from those entering the temple. And when he saw Peter and John about to go into the temple, he asked them for alms. And Peter looked intently at him, as did John, and said, "Look at us." And he fixed his attention on them, expecting to receive something from them. But Peter said, "I have no silver or gold. What I have I give you in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Stand up and walk." And he took him by the right hand and raised him up, and immediately his feet and ankles were made strong. And jumping up, he stood and began to walk, and he entered the temple with them, walking and leaping and praising God. And all the people saw him walking and praising God, and they recognized him as the one who used to sit and ask for alms at the Beautiful Gate of the temple, and they were filled with wonder and amazement at what had happened to him. That phrase, Beautiful Gate, is only found here in this story, but we believe that it was the gate in the court of women. Remember, we've already learned the story of the widow's mite, and that happened in the court of the women. So it's cool to consider that this particular miracle happens in the same place as the earlier story that I read to you from Luke chapter 2. Acts is a sequel to Luke, and so this is a retelling to say that in this same place where we had a lesson on offerings, we get a new lesson with this healing of a man. The Beautiful Gate is an important detail because we also believe from outside writings that the Beautiful Gate was made of Corinthian bronze. Now, this is a fun story to tell you. So when you go look at the model outside, you'll see the inner court of the women, and you'll see Dr. Ellis has made like a gold-looking gate, if you will. Corinthian bronze was a fabled alloy, and it was very, very hard to get. And it was like, again, this thing brings in $150 million a year, right? It ought to be nice. And the legend goes that in Corinth, which is a city in the eastern Mediterranean in Greece on the Achaean Peninsula, was destroyed in 146 BC, to be specific, by the Romans. And it was such a wealthy city. And a wealthy city when Paul visited there too and wrote his letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, to them. But such a wealthy city because it sat on two ports, an isthmus, if you will. Altars on every corner, lots of elaborate adornments on these altars, that when the Romans burned it, that all their gold and their silver and their copper melted into the streets and created this new alloy called Corinthian bronze. That's a cool legend, right? Now, so what you've got now is a blind man, not a blind beggar, but rather a lame beggar at the feet of the most fabulously exotic and valuable structure or piece in the whole temple. Let's consider the contrast for a minute. Disability was a death sentence in their world. You only had value when you could produce. We've got these charming stories of Jesus taking children into his arms, and we fail to consider how radical that was because children had no value until they could produce for the family, right? And so for Jesus to say, "Let the little children come to me," is to ascribe value to everybody. Same thing happens here with someone who is lame and they cannot work. All they can do is beg, and yet this man has more value than a gate made of Corinthian bronze. I'll say this one more time. Jesus would call this temple a den of robbers, which was a quotation of Jeremiah chapter 7, and he saw right through it. He saw what God values, not $150 million a year, not a gate of Corinthian bronze, not the wonder of the ancient world, but a soul in need at the foot of the gate. So I've got my own experience with this, and I'll see if y'all got any questions. In the period of time when I was trying to go to seminary in Montgomery, worrying everybody to death, I was just worrying my clergy at Church of the Ascension, where Jim and I grew up. And so what my priest said at the time is, okay, you can lead daily morning prayer in the chapel, right, Rich, while you're getting ready to go to seminary. This will give you something to do, knowing that no one would go. But it would get me off his plate, right? And I wouldn't be bothering him. So I would go to the chapel every day and lead daily morning prayer. At first, I had a few friends that I corralled into going, quickly fell off to nothing, except for one lady. Her name was Mary Dean. And Mary Dean was colorful, to say the least. Mary Dean had an old Grand Prix, big one, kind of a refrigerator green, covered in Wallace stickers. Do you remember Wallace stickers? They were bright orange. And so it was like encrusted in Wallace stickers, hood, front, back, everything. And Mary Dean also was apt to sort of make sounds during morning prayer, and she'd just sort of pop off and just sort of say some things depending on how her medicine was going, and it was just driving me crazy. Here I am. I'm aspiring to greatness in the church, people, and I'm in the chapel every day with Mary Dean. And so one day I'm walking down the hall, and it was Bill Russell. Remember Bill, Gentle Bill, Father Bill. You never heard a fly, Father Bill. He asked me how morning prayer was going. I said, it's not. It's just me and Mary Dean, right? And that gentle, monkish soul grabbed me by the throat. Oh, yeah, some more ascensioners back there. Grabbed me by the throat, pushed me against the wall, and said, don't you ever forget, she has a soul. I never forgot. I was chastened, embarrassed. We continued morning prayer with Mary Dean. She continued to make sounds, and I understood. I probably had an angel in my midst or somebody to teach me something. It's a lesson that I never forgot. Mary Dean died while I was in seminary, but not before writing me a card to say I was her favorite preacher. At the foot of the beautiful gate, right? People are what God values. Money is a tool to help them. Amen. So let me turn this off and see if you have any questions.